Hello, I'm just gonna start my explanation video for how to implement Simon sets in Python. In this game, the computer shows a sequence of colors and sound, and your job is to remember and repeat that exact sequence. Each round gets a little longer, so it really tests your memory and focus. Before we jump into coding, it's really important to understand a few key ideas that make everything works. By checking these knowledges, you can build understanding of how game development works. So we're gonna start from coordinates.
In mathematics, we usually use x-axis and y-axis. The origin is based on the center of the axes. So if you want to move to coordinates at 1, 3, you move 1 on the right and 3 upward. But in game development or image processing field, we often use another world, which consists of row axis and column axis. The origin starts from top left corner of the window. So if you want to move from the origin to 4, 3 in this world, you have to move downward at 4 point and on the right 3 points. Let's quickly move to pixel and colors. Let's start from pixels. A pixel is the smallest dot on the screen, kind of like a tiny square that makes up the whole image. When we draw something in the game, we are actually telling the computer which pixels to light up and where. Each pixel contains colors. RGB color is one of the most common ways to represent color. And let's take a look of this small grid. If we zoom up, it looks a little bit too big for us. So let's zoom up again. And it's still big. Let's zoom up. This is the last time. So we found out this one pixel has this color and this much of components of red, green, blue. Each color component can be from 0 to 255 usually. If it's 0, that means the component has no brightness. So if there's no brightness, then we don't have color. This is the end of the background knowledge check section. Now we can move on to peek at the files that we're gonna work on. Reading the code before we work on is very important to understand what kind of features or functionalities we have to implement and how everything works together. We're gonna work on main and button files. In main.py file, you can see a bunch of constants at the front of the file and also support functions. For example, CPU turn and player turn, which is very common to see in this kind of game development. The most importantly, there is a game loop section at the bottom of the file, which handles when player stop playing the game and updating the screen based on the interaction. In button.py file, you can see object declaration for button class. It looks like we have update function to update the button states, or checking if button is selected, or even drawing the button. And also we can see that there's a top left keyword in this implementation as we reviewed in the previous section. Now we can move on to learning Pygame library, which is very important to develop a game in Python. When we learn new libraries or new tools, it is very important to understand what does it do. if it's functional objects, what does it receive as a parameter? Or even what does it return? It is also very important to read the official documents to learn new tools. If you go to the official website for Pygame, you can find description of each functions or object's declaration. Also, there's a search bar for you. Let's quickly touch how Pygame works. For example, Pygame.surface is an object declaration for surface type object. It takes width and height as a parameter and returns an object. Based on this object, you can use a bunch of functions, which is crucial to develop this game. You can pause the video and go to the website and look up the function description for yourself. Now we finished all steps to start the implementation. But where to start? I usually recommend to go to the smaller parts and then gradually adding to the bigger functions or classes. So we have main.py and button.py files. Which one would be the smaller implementation or composite of the other? It looks like our first mission is starting identifying the parameters of the button class. To answer this question, you can go to main.py file and see how button objects is declared. Those parameters in those declarations should be the ones we need to define in init function in button.py file. Now we can move on to the actual implementation section. It looks like we only have 8 features to develop this game, and we can divide 4 features for button.py file and another 4 features for main.py file. Let's start finding properties for the button class. Init function in Python class is usually used for initializing the properties. Probably better to go to the main file and see how this button object is initialized. It looks like button object is supposed to have 5 parameters. The first 2 of them is button color to show switch on and off. The third one is sound object from Pygame. The last 2 components are coordinates for button position X and Y. If we add the parameters and properties, it's gonna be like this. And also we need to note that we have to assign X and Y coordinates to annotate the top left corner of the rectangle object. Let's move on to draw the button section. We have to bleed image here, meaning we have to render the button based on the XY coordinates. We have bleed function as we mentioned in the previous section from the Pygame library. Do you know what to put in these parameters? The first parameter should be the image we want to render, which we can access as we initialized in the init function. And then the second one is XY coordinates. Since this is a coordinates for button, we can use self.rect.topleft. Let's move on to selected function which checks if given button is clicked or not. As I mentioned in the previous section, we can use Pygame library that has .collide_point function. Since this function returns true or false, we can return this function directly, checking if the input mouse position is within the surface area of self.rect. In update function, we only have to change the color from color off to color on by using .fill function from Pygame, and also bleed the image again so that we can animate the illumination of the button pushed by the player. The first 2 lines are pretty easy as we saw in the previous sections. But for the sound line, we have to check if these sound properties we initialized in the init function is object or function. To check if this is object or not, we should go back to the main file again. And it looks like Pygame sound object is passed on as a parameter in the button initialization. So we just have to call .play function from pygame.soundObject. Now we can move on to main.py file implementation. Let's set the properties for main file. It looks like we have to write for sound objects for different color buttons and also initialize different buttons for different colors using the constants variable, which is already declared. It should be pretty straightforward as we only have to set the path for sound and different button colors. In drawBoard function, we only have to draw the buttons for each color. It should be straightforward as we implemented the draw function in the button class. We just need to call them on each color. For checking colors feature, we have to implement CPU turn function. This function randomly picks the color and then append to CPU sequence list to check later. And based on the color, we have to update the button color so that player can easily recognize. We can use if-else statements to check which color is picked and then update the button color based on the color. In the last feature, we're gonna start setting the timer so that we can set the time limit for the player to select the button. Based on the selected button, we're gonna check if it is a correct button in the CPU sequence. We need to use getPosition function from the Pygame and also implement the chunk of the function for each color. So you can use pygame.mouse.getPosition function from the library to get the mouse position and use if-else statement to implement the rest of the code. For each color, we have to update the button and append to the player sequence list so we can check if it's correct or not.